I hadn't been back to my valley cabin in over a year. Work dragged on longer than planned, and winter turned the road into a mess of ice and mud. So when I finally eased my truck through the old timber gate at the bottom of the valley, I was expecting what I'd always found there: quiet. Pine trees swaying, wind moving through the creek. That familiar stillness that made the place feel untouched. I didn't even shut the engine off before someone started yelling. A woman I'd never seen before was storming down the gravel road toward me, clipboard clutched to her chest like a badge of authority. She was already mid-rant before she got close enough for me to see her name tag. She said I was trespassing. She said the valley was now part of a private residential development, and she said I had 5 minutes to leave before fines started piling up. I just stood there with my keys in my hand, trying to process what I was hearing. Because the road she stood on? The creek behind her? Every cabin scattered across that valley floor? My family had owned all of it for 3 generations. She didn't know that yet. But she was about to learn. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My family's connection to that valley goes back longer than most of the trees lining the creek. My grandfather bought the land decades ago, back when it was nothing but rough timber, uneven trails, and a single dirt road cutting through the hills. He wasn't a developer. He wasn't trying to flip it. He just wanted a place where his kids and, eventually, his grandkids could disappear for a while and breathe. Over the years, the property stayed whole. One deed. One continuous stretch of land running from the valley entrance, all the way down to the far ridge line. The cabin I use now wasn't the only structure either. There were a couple of smaller cabins tucked farther back, an old equipment shed near the creek, and cleared areas my grandfather had marked long ago for future use. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy, just land that had always been ours. That's why I barely recognized the place when I came back. Near the entrance of the valley, where the dirt road widens before narrowing again, there were brand new cabins I had never seen before. Clean lines, fresh paint, decorative stonework. They stood out in a way that felt wrong, like luxury hotel rooms dropped into the middle of untouched land. A polished wooden sign sat near the gate advertising exclusive mountain living, complete with a stylized logo and a name I didn't recognize. It didn't take long to figure out what had happened. While I'd been gone, someone had bought a parcel of land near the valley entrance and built an upscale development designed to look private, secluded, and self-contained. The cabins were close enough together to feel intentional, but far enough from the main road to sell the illusion of isolation, and, as I would soon learn, they came with the homeowners association. The woman with the clipboard introduced herself as Linda Carver. She was impeccably dressed for someone standing on a gravel road, boots spotless, jacket pressed, hair pulled back so tight it didn't move when she talked. She spoke fast and confidently, like she'd repeated the same lines dozens of times and expected them to work every time. She told me she was the HOA president. She said the association managed all common areas in the valley, including the road, creek access, and what she referred to as shared environmental features. She spoke as if those words alone were supposed to settle the matter. At first, I assumed there had been a genuine mistake. Developments get their boundaries wrong all the time. Maps get misread. Someone files paperwork without fully understanding what they're buying. I figured all it would take was a quick explanation and maybe a copy of my deed to clear things up. That assumption didn't last long. Linda pulled a neatly organized packet from her clipboard and handed it to me like she was issuing a citation. Inside were printed HOA rules, violation notices, and a summary sheet with my cabin address typed neatly at the top. She said my cabin was out of compliance. She pointed to the exterior siding and said it didn't meet HOA aesthetic standards. She noted that I wasn't registered with the association. She highlighted sections about unauthorized land use, unapproved structures, and penalties for continued violations. She spoke calmly, but there was something rehearsed about it, like she was ticking boxes rather than having a conversation. I told her, just as calmly, that my cabin had been there long before the HOA existed. I explained that the land was family-owned, and that nothing about my property fell under their authority. She barely reacted. Instead, she smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Everyone says that." That was the moment I realized this wasn't her first confrontation. She didn't ask for documents. She didn't ask questions. She didn't show any interest in hearing details. To her, my explanation wasn't information, it was noise. She told me the HOA had maps. She said they'd done surveys. She claimed the road was private infrastructure maintained by the association. According to her, access to the creek was a shared privilege granted by HOA membership, not a right tied to land ownership. I tried again, slower this time, explaining that my family had owned the valley as a single parcel for generations, that the road existed long before any development, that the creek ran through our land, not theirs. She cut me off. "If you're not registered with the HOA," she said, tapping the packet with her finger, "you're not authorized to be here." That sentence stuck with me. Not because it made sense, but because of how confidently she said it. She told me I'd start accruing fines if I didn't comply. She told me inspections would be scheduled. She told me the HOA took violations seriously and had ways of enforcing compliance. And as she turned and walked back toward the new cabins near the entrance, I realized something unsettling. She wasn't confused. She was counting on me backing down. The letters started arriving less than a week after that first encounter. At first, it was just one envelope taped to the cabin door when I came back from checking the creek. Bright white paper, bold lettering, and my name printed cleanly across the front like it had been pulled from a database. Inside was a formal notice listing documented violations and a deadline to respond. Then another one showed up. And another. Some were mailed. Some were taped directly to the door, as if they wanted to be sure I couldn't claim I hadn't seen them. Each notice listed new infractions or repeated the same ones with slightly different wording. Exterior materials. Unauthorized occupancy. Failure to register with the association. Use of restricted access roads. The fines started small, but they stacked fast. A daily amount multiplied by each unresolved violation. At the bottom of every page was the same sentence, printed in heavy type: failure to comply may result in liens, legal action, or restriction of access. That last part caught my attention. Restriction of access. They were threatening to block the only road into the valley. I still believed this could be handled calmly, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I responded with paperwork. I emailed copies of my deed. I attached county parcel maps showing my family's ownership. I referenced recorded easements and historical filings. I asked politely for a meeting to clarify boundaries and resolve the issue before it escalated any further. The replies I got back didn't acknowledge a single document. Every response looked the same. Short, polite, vague. Thank you for reaching out. Please review the attached compliance guidelines. Your concerns have been noted. Violations remain active. Failure to comply within the stated time frame will result in further action. They never addressed the deed. They never commented on the maps. They never answered my questions about jurisdiction. It felt less like a conversation and more like shouting into a locked room. A few days later, Linda showed up again. No call, no email, just her SUV parked near the cabin when I returned from town. She stepped out with the same clipboard, the same practiced confidence, and a new set of papers tucked neatly under her arm. She told me she was conducting a site review. I reminded her she didn't have permission to be there. She ignored that and spread out a series of survey maps on the hood of her vehicle. They were clean, professional-looking documents with color-coded lines and labels. She pointed to one section, and explained that the HOA controlled the road, the creek access, and the surrounding valley floor. I noticed something immediately. The map stopped just short of my cabin, not around it, not including it, just stopped. Like someone had drawn a box and decided not to finish the last line. I asked her where the rest of the parcel was. She said it wasn't relevant. She told me the HOA had updated surveys and that older records were often inaccurate. She said developments like theirs required centralized management to protect property values and maintain order. She spoke slowly, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. Then she said it. The HOA controls the valley now, not manages, not oversees, controls. That word sat heavy in the air. I asked her how an association that had existed for only a few years could control land that had been deeded to my family for generations. I asked her how they could issue fines on property they didn't own. I asked her why none of my documents had been addressed. She didn't answer any of that. Instead, she reminded me of the fines. She pointed out the growing total. She warned me again about liens. She said access restrictions were already being discussed. Then she smiled and said I could avoid all of it by registering with the HOA and bringing my cabin into compliance. That was the moment something clicked. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't bad mapping. This wasn't an honest mistake. It was pressure. They weren't trying to prove ownership. They were trying to overwhelm me with paperwork, deadlines, and consequences until it felt easier to give in than to fight. Ignore the documents. Repeat the threats. Act confident long enough and most people would fold. As Linda walked away, I stood there looking at the growing stack of notices in my hand and realized the truth. They weren't going to stop on their own, and they weren't going to admit they were wrong. If this was going to end, it wouldn't be because they suddenly listened. It would be because I forced them to. I drove into town early the next morning. Not angry, not panicked, just focused. Up until that point, everything I'd done had been reactive. Answering letters, responding to emails, explaining the same facts over and over to people who clearly weren't listening. If this was going to turn into something bigger, I needed to stop arguing on their terms and start verifying everything on mine. So I went to the county assessor's office. The building itself was nothing special. Low ceilings, old carpet, fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. The kind of place people usually visit for tax questions or boundary clarifications, not to untangle a land grab. I took a number, waited my turn, and explained to the clerk that I needed to review parcel records for a property in the valley. She asked for the parcel number. When I gave it to her, she raised an eyebrow. She pulled up the master parcel map on her screen and leaned closer, scrolling slowly. At first, she didn't say anything. She zoomed out, then back in, adjusting layers, turning on historical records. The longer she looked, the quieter she got. Finally, she asked, "How long has an HOA been claiming this land?" That was the moment I knew something wasn't right. I told her about the development near the valley entrance. I told her about the notices, the fines, the claims of ownership over the road and creek. I mentioned the HOA president by name. She shook her head and rotated the screen so I could see it clearly. The HOA didn't own the valley, not even close. According to the county records, the association had purchased a narrow strip of land near the entrance years earlier, just enough to build their cabins and install signage. Everything beyond that strip, including the valley floor, the creek, and the road winding through it, belonged to a single continuous parcel, my family's parcel. The clerk clicked through additional documents and pointed to the boundaries. The maps Linda had shown me suddenly made sense. They weren't wrong because of bad data. They were wrong because they were incomplete, selectively cropped. They ended right where the HOA's ownership ended and pretended the rest didn't exist. Then she pulled up something even more important. The road. The very road the HOA claimed was private infrastructure turned out to be a recorded easement, filed decades ago and still active. It had been granted by my grandfather to allow neighboring properties limited access through the valley. The easement spelled out maintenance rights, usage terms, and, most importantly, ownership. The road wasn't theirs. It never had been. The clerk printed everything: parcel maps, easement filings, historical deeds, and transaction records. She stamped each page and told me to keep the original safe. Before I left, she looked at me and said, "If they're claiming control over land they don't own, that's not an HOA issue. That's a legal problem." I walked out of that office feeling something I hadn't felt since this started. Clarity. For the first time, I wasn't guessing. I wasn't assuming. I wasn't hoping reason would prevail. I had official records, unbroken ownership, and documented proof that the HOA's authority stopped long before it reached my cabin. Back at the valley, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send emails. I didn't argue. Instead, I set up a folder. Every notice went in chronological order. Every email got printed and logged. Every time Linda showed up unannounced, I wrote down the date, time, and what she said. I photographed the signs, the posted notices, in the areas they claimed as common. I stopped reacting and started documenting. Because once the facts were clear, I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to let the paper do the talking. Something changed after that trip to the assessor's office. Not outside, not with the HOA, inside me. Before, every letter felt like an attack that demanded an immediate response. Every threat pushed a spike of anger or disbelief that made me want to fire back just to be heard. That stopped. From that point on, I didn't respond emotionally at all. Every new HOA notice was handled the same way. I copied the envelope, I logged the date, then I answered with certified mail. Inside each response were the same documents, arranged neatly and consistently: copies of my deed, the full parcel map, the recorded easement language, and the assessor's stamped confirmation of ownership. No commentary, no arguing, just facts. At the end of each letter, I included a single request: formal proof of the HOA's jurisdiction over my property. Not opinions, not assumptions. Proof. Weeks went by, and they never produced it. Instead, the tone of their notices shifted. The language grew sharper. The deadlines shorter. References to fines were replaced with phrases like enforcement action and administrative remedies. Then, one afternoon, I received a notice that crossed a line. The HOA had scheduled a compliance inspection of my cabin. No request, no consent. Just a date and a time. They claimed it was authorized under HOA bylaws. Bylaws I was not a member of. On land they did not own. I didn't respond to that notice at all. Instead, I made a call. The attorney I contacted specialized in property and land use, the kind of lawyer who reads deeds for a living and treats boundary disputes like puzzles rather than arguments. I gave him the full timeline, the documents, and copies of every letter the HOA had sent. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he said, "They know better." That was all I needed to hear. He drafted a single letter addressed to the HOA board. Not threatening, not aggressive, just precise. It laid out the chain of title to the valley. It cited the recorded easement granted by my grandfather. It noted that the HOA's jurisdiction ended at their parcel boundary and did not extend to my property in any form. It formally denied permission for any inspection, entry, or enforcement action on my land. And it included one final sentence: any further attempts to assert authority, interfere with access, or impose fines would be documented as intentional misrepresentation and trespass. The letter went out certified. So did copies to the county. The response was immediate. Within 48 hours, the inspection notice disappeared from the HOA's online portal. The daily fines stopped increasing. The form emails went quiet. Linda didn't come back to the cabin. They still hadn't admitted they were wrong. but they were no longer acting like they were in control, and that told me everything I needed to know. Paperwork hadn't just slowed them down, it had rattled them. The notice for the emergency HOA meeting landed in my inbox late on a Sunday night. No explanation, no agenda. Just a time, a place, and the word, mandatory, highlighted in bold. That alone told me more than any email they'd sent before. I showed up early, not to make a point, but because I wanted to sit quietly and watch the room fill. The meeting was held in a rented community hall near the valley entrance, the kind with folding chairs and a projector screen that never quite sits straight. One by one, homeowners from the new development filed in. Most of them looked confused. A few looked irritated. A handful avoided eye contact altogether. Linda was already there, pacing near the front with her clipboard and laptop, talking in low tones to two board members. She looked polished as ever, but there was something tight in her posture now, something restless. I took a seat near the back. When the meeting started, Linda didn't waste time. She launched straight into a presentation titled Valley Management Overview. Slides flashed across the screen showing aerial photos, colored overlays, and arrows pointing confidently across the landscape. She spoke about preserving property values, maintaining order, and protecting shared resources. She used phrases like unified land strategy and long-term control. She never once mentioned my name. Instead, she referred to a non-compliant structure and unauthorized land use, in vague terms, framing the situation as a threat to the community rather than a dispute over facts. She claimed the HOA had a responsibility to assert authority over the valley to prevent chaos. I let her talk. I watched the faces in the room as she spoke. Some homeowners nodded along, clearly trusting that she knew what she was doing. Others looked uneasy, glancing at the maps like they were trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew of the land. When Linda finished, she asked if there were any questions. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said I'd brought legal counsel with me and asked if the board objected to him addressing the room. They didn't. My attorney stood and walked to the front carrying a thin stack of papers. No theatrics, no slides, just documents. He began by introducing himself and explaining that he represented the owner of the valley floor. Then he started handing copies to the board members, the HOA's legal representative, and anyone else who asked. Parcel maps, recorded deeds, easement filings, a complete title history. As the papers circulated, the room grew quiet. My attorney explained that the HOA's ownership extended only to the parcels near the valley entrance. He pointed out the exact boundaries, referencing county stamps and recording numbers. He explained that the road was not private HOA infrastructure, but a recorded easement granted decades earlier, still active and enforceable. Then he delivered the line that changed everything. According to the county records, my family owned the entire valley floor. Not most of it, not part of it, all of it, including sections of land where several HOA cabins were partially built. You could hear chairs shift. Someone near the front let out a sharp breath. A board member flipped through the pages faster, like they were hoping the answer would change if they looked hard enough. Linda spoke up quickly. She said there must be a misunderstanding. She said the HOA had relied on surveys provided during development. She said she was sure the issue could be resolved internally. My attorney calmly responded that the surveys she referenced were incomplete and selectively cropped. He explained that misrepresenting land ownership, especially in a sales context, was a serious issue. Linda started backtracking. She said the HOA never intended to claim ownership. She said the language in the notices may have been misinterpreted. She said the association only wanted cooperation. No one was nodding anymore. The board members stopped looking at her and started looking at the documents. One of them asked quietly whether this had been disclosed when the lots were sold. Another asked why they were just finding out about it now. Linda didn't answer either question. By the time the meeting ended, the tone in the room had completely shifted. The authority Linda had walked in with was gone, replaced by something closer to suspicion. The homeowners filed out in silence, clutching copies of maps they hadn't known existed an hour earlier. I stayed seated until the room emptied. I didn't need to say anything else. The facts had already done the work. Things moved quickly after that meeting. Not loudly, not publicly, but with the kind of momentum that only starts once official eyes are involved. Within a week, the county contacted me directly. Not to ask questions, to confirm details. They already had copies of the documents my attorney had sent, along with complaints that had been filed by more than one HOA homeowner after the meeting. That was enough to trigger an audit. The county requested development records, survey submissions, and disclosures tied to the HOA's formation and lot sales. They pulled building permits. They reviewed marketing materials. They compared what buyers had been told against what the recorded parcels actually showed. The gap was impossible to ignore. The HOA had never owned the valley. They had never had authority over the road or the creek. And yet, those features were repeatedly described in sales documents as shared amenities controlled by the association. Buyers were shown maps that implied far more land than the HOA legally possessed. The selective cropping I'd noticed wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Linda had signed off on all of it. Emails surfaced, internal notes, early drafts of marketing brochures that had been edited to remove boundary disclaimers. In several cases, lot prices had been justified using language that implied private valley access and exclusive control. None of that was true. Once the county finalized its findings, the consequences followed in rapid succession. The HOA received formal notice that its authority extended only to its actual parcels. Any attempt to enforce rules, issue fines, or restrict access beyond those boundaries was prohibited. All enforcement actions against me were voided. Every notice, every fine, every threat, gone. Linda didn't wait for a formal vote. She resigned as HOA president 2 days after the county findings were circulated to the board. The resignation email was short and carefully worded, citing personal reasons and a desire to avoid further distraction. It didn't include an apology. It didn't include an explanation. It didn't need to. Homeowners began demanding answers almost immediately. Some asked for refunds. Others wanted to know why their property values had been built on claims that were now officially false. A few sought legal counsel of their own, especially those whose cabins sat uncomfortably close to boundaries they'd never been shown before. The HOA board went silent. Meetings were postponed. Communications stopped. The confident language that once filled every notice disappeared overnight, replaced by uncertainty and legal caution. Back in the valley, the changes were subtle but profound. The signs near the entrance came down. The language about private access quietly vanished from the development's website. No one showed up with clipboards. No letters appeared on my door. The road remained open. The creek flowed as it always had. And for the first time since I'd returned, the valley was quiet again. Not the tense, waiting silence of a standoff, but the natural kind. Wind through the trees, water over stones. The kind of quiet my grandfather had built the cabin for in the first place. Ownership hadn't been something I needed to announce. It had revealed itself on its own. The official end didn't come with an announcement. There was no final email, no dramatic vote, no last meeting where everything was said out loud. The HOA simply unraveled. Over the months that followed the county audit, the board struggled to function. Members resigned quietly. Legal bills piled up. Homeowners stopped paying dues once it became clear the association's authority had been built on promises it couldn't keep. By the end of the year, the HOA was dissolved. The development didn't disappear, but the illusion that came with it did. The cabins near the valley entrance became just what they had always been beneath the marketing language. Private homes sitting on clearly defined parcels, no more and no less. Without the HOA acting as an intermediary, residents were forced to confront the reality of where their land ended and where mine began. That's when the conversations changed. A few homeowners reached out directly, cautiously at first. They weren't looking to argue. They weren't demanding control. They just wanted clarity. Some had been told they would have permanent access to the valley. Others had been assured the road would always be private and maintained for them. Now they were learning that neither claim had ever been guaranteed. I listened. None of this had been their fault. They'd trusted the wrong person, just like I'd assumed this was all a misunderstanding at the beginning. So instead of closing ranks, I did the opposite. I worked with my attorney in the county to formalize access agreements. Everything was recorded. Everything was transparent. The road easement my grandfather had granted decades earlier was updated to reflect modern usage, clear maintenance responsibilities, and defined limits. Creek access was spelled out in plain language, with protections in place to preserve the land rather than exploit it. No assumptions. No vague promises. Just terms everyone could see and understand. Some homeowners accepted the new agreements. Others chose not to. That was fine too. The important thing was that, for the first time, the valley wasn't being managed by fear, fines, or invented authority. It was being respected. I posted clear signage at the entrance. Not threatening, not aggressive, just factual. Property boundaries. Access guidelines. Contact information. The kind of clarity that prevents conflict instead of creating it. The cabin stayed exactly as it was. No aesthetic rules, no inspections, no approvals needed. The creek ran clean, the trails stayed open under agreed terms, and the land remained intact. Protected not by an HOA, but by accurate records and mutual understanding. Sometimes, I'd sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the light move across the valley, thinking about how easily it could have gone another way. How pressure and noise nearly turned something peaceful into a permanent fight. Instead, it ended quietly. The way it should have from the beginning. The valley didn't belong to an association. It never had. It belonged to the land itself, and to the people willing to respect it. I never planned to fight an HOA. All I wanted was to come back to a place that had always felt like home. A quiet valley, a simple cabin, and the kind of peace my grandfather had built into that land long before anyone thought to put rules on it. I didn't arrive looking for conflict. I didn't come with an agenda. I just unlocked the gate and expected things to be the way they had always been. What this whole experience taught me is something I won't forget. The loudest authority is often the weakest. Real ownership doesn't rely on threats, fines, or clipboards. It relies on records, patience, and the truth sitting quietly in a filing cabinet somewhere, waiting for the right moment to surface. Paperwork doesn't get emotional. It doesn't argue. And it always outlasts intimidation. If Linda had asked instead of demanded, if she had slowed down long enough to check what she was claiming, this story would have ended before it ever began. But she chose pressure over proof, confidence over facts. And the valley corrected that mistake on its own terms. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no standoffs, just a return to balance. The land stayed protected. The cabin stayed mine. And the valley went back to being what it had always been, quiet, steady, and uninterested in who thought they were in charge. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?